My name is Nicholas Rouleau. I'm the co-chair of the CPC, Canadian International Council, which is one of the co-sponsors of the event, along with Section 1, which I'll get to in a second. The CIC is Canada's oldest non-partisan foreign policy organization. We're founded in 1928, so we're just about to hit our 100th anniversary. We're non-partisan, as I've mentioned, which means we don't take any policy line of our own. We essentially try to foster engagement amongst Canadians in foreign policy, because we think a more educated population is one that's going to lead to better policy outcomes for Canada. We've been doing that for almost 100 years. Part of our programming, or one of our initiatives, is the Henry and R. Jackman book series, which is a collaboration with Dundurn Press. Dundurn is one of Canada's largest and leading independent trade publishers. And we in Dundurn think it's important to promote Canadian intellectuals, Canadian thinkers, homegrown individuals who are leading and shaping Canadian reflection about foreign policy. So we can all agree, I think, that especially in this time, a more informed dialogue is what's needed, and this is exactly what this book series is trying to accomplish. Tonight's subject matter is obviously very relevant to all of us: liberal democracy, its foundations, its resilience, its tenability. Here's an interesting stat. For the first time in 20 years, autocracies outnumber democracies globally. I don't think that's a direction we want to be going in. And liberal democracies continue to be the rarest forms of democracy in the world. So a 2025 report produced by Democracy Without Borders found that less than 13% of the world's population currently lives in liberal democracies, which is the lowest level in over 50 years. So cherish it, because it's not everywhere that they can say it. So an exploration of the intellectual argument framing the decline of liberal democracies, I think, is very apropos today. And I can't think of a better person, or two better individuals, to discuss this. First, I'll introduce to you Michael Bonner, who's our featured speaker today. Michael's been a friend for 25 years, and he's always been a challenging, provoking, thoughtful, engaging speaker, interlocutor, always thinking and not unwilling to challenge conventional wisdom. That's always been, I think, a very important trait in Michael, and something that comes through in his book and in any conversation you will have with him. He's, I guess, what we call in the business a triple threat. He's a communications and public policy advisor, so he's into policy. He's a historian, or a classicist, I suppose he'd probably call himself, with a focus on ancient Persia, in case you didn't know. Turns out he speaks Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, ancient Persian. He'll take questions in any of those languages but he's also a writer, and that's what he's here for today, a writer and a thinker. His previous book, which was excellent, by the way, I recommend you read it and purchase it from McNally's, which is here at the back selling his current book. But his previous book was In Defense of Civilization, which looked at what makes, or what creates civilization, and how it declines and needs to be renewed to some extent over the years, and the process that it takes part was fantastic. As I said, I recommend it. And today, his new book, which we're here to celebrate and to speak about, is The Crisis of Liberalism, which will leave all your questions about liberal democracy and its decline and how to get away from it answered. So you shouldn't need anything else after today on that topic. And the reason you won't need anything else is because of the person introducing, or person presenting along with Michael, engaging with them and asking them questions, which is who is Peter Biro, who is also, from my experience, a very critical, engaging, and deep thinker about the topic of liberal democracy. So you couldn't have the makings of a better conversation today. Peter was a successful Bay Street lawyer who's lived the dream that other less successful Bay Street lawyers want to do, which is that he escaped from law and went into thinking rather than practicing. He's the founder and president of Section 1, which is a democracy and civics education organization, as well as a co-sponsor for tonight's event. It's an organization that means to challenge and engage citizens in the thinking about the foundation of liberal democracy, and believes that engagement isn't simply reading and being informed about it, but acting out the tenets of a liberal democracy. Peter's also an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law, and he teaches on constitutional law. He's the chair emeritus of the Jane Goodall Institute. He's a member of the CIC's advisory board, so a true friend of the CIC, and we're very, very glad to have him with us tonight. And I leave it to the two of you for what should be a wonderful conversation.
It is wonderful to see so many people so interested and passionate about esoterica, which for those of you who don't know is porn for the enlightened soul and the curious mind, or as erotica otherwise describes it. It's fantastic because, you know, on the serious note, this book, as I've said and written, in fact, it's even on the front cover of the book, is a very important book. There aren't a lot of books these days that are written like this, that contain both the depth and range of intellectual history, the moral clarity, and the ability to connect the history of ideas, the genealogy of ideas, with contemporary controversies. And that help us understand where we are today by understanding how the ideas that originated a very long time ago in places far, far away influenced the development of our civilization. I want to use this opportunity to let Michael really tell his own story and kind of flesh out his own argument and his thesis for you. So I'm going to begin by reading just a few lines, a few passages from one of the chapters in the book, which chapter 11 called The Crisis of Liberalism, which I think kind of lays out in a relatively cryptic way the essence of the argument. And then I'm going to ask Michael maybe to use that as a jumping off point. I note that elsewhere in the book you cite Judith Sklar, great philosopher. I think is she at Princeton, or where was Judith Sklar? I don't know where she was. But
it may well have been Princeton.
Tremendously influential political philosopher who incorrectly said that the goal of liberalism is to secure the conditions for personal freedom. But because that is the theme of today's talk, and because there are many other things in this book that I vehemently disagree with, I'm going to move on to Michael's version of what the crisis of liberalism is so that he has an opportunity to kind of articulate it for you. So let me start with a few lines, and then I'll ask you to reflect on this. Liberalism claims disinterested neutrality, but seeks to impose a particular vision of the good life. Parenthetically, I disagree with that point. It encourages experiments of living, not for their own sake or for the sake of variety, but to hasten convergence upon a single lifestyle of higher mental cultivation. The relentless skepticism and questioning by experts that characterizes liberalism in this form aims at social improvement. I definitely agree with that. But what it achieves is often the erosion of social conventions, either leaving them in ruins or replacing them with new customs. The crisis before us is twofold, and this is the way that Michael frames the crisis in this kind of cryptic formulation that I think is excellent. First, when unmoored from its Christian theological foundation. So this book is largely about the forgotten theological origin of the liberal conception of freedom. When unmoored from its Christian theological foundation, liberalism simply becomes harder and harder to understand and defend, a growing problem in the pluralist West. Second, liberalism has so far been unable to respond helpfully to the problems of modernity. Liberalism offers no solution to and tends to exacerbate the troubles of deracination, dislocation, and disruption imposed on us by industrial capitalism and modern technology. And I just want to knit that together with a final passage, which is a quote from Fukuyama, with which you end that chapter. And you're talking about, you introduce it by talking about, the liberals, the Canadians, the European elite, and so on and so forth. Such people, you say, have known one solution only, and that is greater personal freedom in opposition to a common culture, settled communities, stable institutions, and a willingness to defend them by force. Francis Fukuyama foresaw this problem, and I'll give him the last word. What threatens the possibility of meaningful community, says Fukuyama, is not a force external to the community, but those very principles of liberty, equality, and equality on which they're based. Liberal democracies, in other words, are not self-sufficient. The community life on which they depend must ultimately come from a source different from liberalism itself. In the long run, those liberal principles have had a corrosive effect on the values predating liberalism necessary to sustain strong communities and thereby on a liberal society's ability to be self-sustaining.
Okay.
What do you have to say about that?
Two things. So the book had to have a punchy, sort of a gripping title, and I would have preferred a much sort of longer, 18th century style title. It could have been called, Reflections on the Paradoxes and Crises of Liberalism, but Crisis of Liberalism seemed sort of succinct. It falls into broadly into two halves. The first half is an exposition of the assumptions that lie behind liberalism, and this is what opens the door to mostly scholastic theological debates that occurred long before the word liberal was used in a political sense, but which nevertheless shaped opinions on things like the equality of persons, free will, the separation of church and state, as we call it, and basically everything else that is taken for granted within a liberal context. By the time John Locke comes along, who many regard as the first liberal, that's a matter of debate, but many believe that. Locke is asserting principles that he thinks are obvious and straightforward, clear to everybody, but they were shaped by hundreds, if not a good 1,000 years of theological opinions behind them. In fact, the notion of free will, which is so important to liberalism, such as it was inherited, is derived not from observations about people in the tradition that was inherited and passed on, but rather from theology. This may sound strange and weird, but it's true. So that's one half of the book. The second half of the book is about essentially whether or not this emphasis on freedom, as is now a sort of a common phrase, meets the moment. Now, I would say that it certainly did meet the moment in many times in the 19th century when the problem was, if you like, community bonds that were perhaps too tight. They were oppressive, stifling, if you like, and things like royal absolutism and a kind of clerical order that was, similarly stifling. It also met the moment, as they say, in the middle of the 20th century, especially in places like Nazi Germany or Eastern Europe, that there would be the whatever you would like to call it, collectivism, or the sort of rigid conformity with ideology, deserve to be shattered by an emphasis on personal autonomy and so forth. But right now, I'm not sure that that's necessarily what. I'm not sure that's necessarily the kind of solution that we're looking for. Now, I don't think that liberalism has been the same at all times in all places. I think there's a kind of liberalism of the past, especially in the middle of the 20th century, often derided as so-called Cold War liberalism. It was much more at ease with the kinds of communitarian bonds that I think are lacking now. But right now, I would say that the cause of human and personal liberty would be better served by dealing with social decomposition rather than trying to assert further individuality, autonomy, and a radical vision of liberty. That's my response.
So, okay, so it sounds to me like there's two important themes coming out of what you're saying. One is the theological origin of the conception of the liberal conception of freedom. I'd like you to say a little bit about that more specifically. And the other is the communitarian critique of liberalism, which is implicit. It gets explicit in various places. I want to ask you a little bit about that later. But it seems to me that as themes in the book, and as more importantly, as important controversies for us today, is this sort of contested view about whether liberalism satisfies the basic requirements of freedom and of justice, and what about modern or contemporary conceptions of liberalism are inadequate to the task of doing those two things. And I think the answer that you're offering goes both back to the theological sort of genealogy of the idea of freedom, but also to the importance of community. Right?
Okay, so why is if I understand the question probably, why is the question of theology important and why is it relevant? There are two important things to stress. One, I simply don't think that it's possible to understand anything if you don't really know where it came from or why anybody thought it was important. That's point number one. So you have, I've already mentioned Locke, but you can take anybody you like from the sort of early modern, or even late medieval period. They have inherited either conceptions that were formed by scholastic debates within Western Christianity, or they inherited the debate itself. Inheriting the debate itself is what you find when it comes to free will. If anyone has had depending on your perspective, the pleasure or the misfortune of reading the actual fight or about the fight between Luther and Erasmus about free will, you can see something that is just constantly going round and round in a circle, and neither is really sort of moving beyond the contours of a contest the contours were determined long in the past, going back to people like Augustine, Eriugena, and Aquinas, and everybody in between. So that question about free will just sort of, or the debate about it, gets taken over wholesale, and all Western political thought, liberal or otherwise, seems to assume that there is such a thing as free will, that we all have it, whether or not we can actually define it and parse it and prove its actual existence or not. It becomes kind of like an axiom of liberalism. Notably, though, the last person to assume or to assert the absolute supremacy of human free will with an explicitly theological argument is, does anybody know? Does anybody want to venture a guess? Raise a hand to guess. No? It was Descartes. Descartes is talking about how he's capable of making these horrible mental errors about things. And his explanation is, God has an absolutely free will. I'm made in the image of God. My will must be like his, almost equally powerful. Therefore, I'm capable of doing almost anything with it, including appalling intellectual mistakes. Food for thought. That will not be that kind of argument will not be repeated again. It's simply taken for granted thereafter. Now, it's relevant for another reason now, which is that in the absence of these debates, or in the absence of even the knowledge about them, these axioms such as free will or human equality and so forth can merely be asserted without proof. The opening of the American Declaration of Independence is an excellent example. The adjective used, actually there were two adjectives originally used by Jefferson. They were sacred and undeniable, crossed out by instruction of Benjamin Franklin and replaced with one word, self-evident. The concept of self-evident truths, we think that might be an 18th century idea, a characteristically Enlightenment notion. It is and it isn't. It comes from simply habituation to old ideas that had been so deeply ingrained that they seem obvious. Well, I put it to you that ideas like fundamental human equality and a supreme free will, the separation of church and state, a progressive vision of history and so forth, all of these things that liberalism takes for granted, they are not self-evident. And they are less evident, perhaps, less obvious to everybody now than they once were. Hence, it is harder to justify the belief system that a liberal must hold. Now, a further consequence of this is that things sort of deteriorate. They become half-hearted assertions. They become words like values. Our Prime Minister published a book called Values, but it doesn't contain any efforts to prove that any of these principles, values are true. And I think there's a good reason for that, which is that we struggle to do so in the absence or in the forgetfulness of the debates and the arguments that once shaped them. Now, there were many other things you asked too, so you'll have to remind me.
Well, no, let's just shift gears a little bit here, because I just want to say, first of all, that I think Kant, in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, would beg to differ on the question of whether a conception of freedom, and of free will indeed, relies or depends on either the existence of God or proof of the existence of God. And I know you mentioned Alasdair MacIntyre only one time in the book, and you mentioned him as having sort of taken issue with or refuted even Kant's rationalism. I don't think he did succeed in doing that. But my more important question about that is this. What the hell does it matter? Oh. Why can't we have a conception of freedom? Or let me put it to you differently. Why does liberalism, or rather the liberal conception of freedom, need to reconnect with its theological origins in order to be rescued from the crisis that you described? Another way of asking that question is, what's wrong with the secular arguments in Kant and, by the way, in Rawls? And I think here, you do say something that I've told you before I disagree with about Rawls, where you say Rawls placed, the idea of free will at the center of his political philosophy. You have to qualify that, I think, by remembering that the so-called free will that's being exercised in a Rawlsian just society is already one constrained by societal arrangements having been decided under the veil of ignorance. So it's not such a question, it's not the kind of free will I think that you think you're referring to when you say that. But just go back to the other question. What's the problem? I mean, what's the problem for liberalism if we're not able to kind of retrieve the theological sort of foundation or reason or justification for a conception of freedom?
Okay, I think I can answer it like this, and we will stay on roles. It may be more.
That's John Rawls.
John Rawls.
Theories of justice. Yeah.
So it may be more than a nuance to say exactly what you just added, that the conception of free will that Rawls has in mind is one that is more. It may be true that it is more circumscribed than the one that I lay out. But my fundamental point is this. If you came to Rawls reading about this concept of freely chosen values, or what Isaiah Berlin might call value pluralism, which are, again, freely chosen, without coercion, and that they kind of intersect and so forth. What if you don't think that the free choice of these things is important? My point about Rawls is that he assumes there is such a thing as free will. It may be different than...
Well, I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not saying free choice isn't or shouldn't be considered to be important. I'm just asking you to focus on why the theological justification is so important.
Because Rawls is assuming that the free choice is operating the same way, or at least mostly the same way, that the old theologians described, and that we have forgotten that. Now, if you turn to modern thinkers, you may not think much of these people or not, I don't know, people like Sam Harris, Richard Sapolsky, they, or Yuval Harari, they argue that free will doesn't exist. Rawls makes no attempt to prove that it is real, at least none that I have seen in his work. He assumes that it is a real thing. And he has to assume it because however else you qualify free choice, you must start from the assumption that it is a real thing. Now, the old arguments about its existence and how it works and where it came from and why we have it and so forth, they may be long far in the past. But even Rawls, who was writing in the 1970s, or others who are still operating, at least in some vague recollection of that paradigm or a kind of cultural memory of that sort of thought world, eventually it will make less and less and less sense until it becomes unintelligible. That's my point.
Okay, let's come at this from another standpoint, which is the communitarian critique of liberalism for a moment. If you're going to focus on what is deficient or inadequate in the liberal account of political life, civil life, I'm with you 100% that liberalism, in any of its formulations or iterations, ever gives an account of what community ought to strive for. All right, what binds it together, other than its commitment to what Kant called the categorical imperative, and what Rawls refers to in a much more elaborate way in the theory of justice. Right, a certain way of living together, pursuing our individual ends, and I do want you to riff a little bit on the universal versus individualism. But ultimately, where I'm with you is in the deficiency of liberalism to give any kind of account of what the public good is, what it looks like. You know, Rawls is famous for having written in one of the editions of A Theory of Justice that, you know, his account of justice is unable to differentiate qualitatively between the value of counting blades of grass versus pursuing some, you know, richer, deeper cultural or emotional or artistic endeavor, right? It can't discriminate or adjudicate between those things. Right? In other words, there's no conception of virtue there, or the good life. I'm with you. I'm with you on that. But again, the question would be, is liberalism able to respond to that critique? Does it have an answer to that critique? Can it accommodate, Sandel in Liberalism and the Limits of Justice criticized liberalism, Rawls's conception of liberalism, as being a politics without persons, by which he meant it was this abstract universe in which we have no conception of what Rawls calls comprehensive moral doctrines. That's for individuals, communities, churches, synagogues, to decide for themselves. And that's kind of the virtue of public life for Rawls, is that you get to decide what aims are worth pursuing. And the communitarian critique says, hold on, and going back to the ancient conception of freedom, which you discuss, right? That incorporates a conception of public duty and not just license, right? What is it that liberalism needs to do now to rescue itself from this fundamental inadequacy?
Well, you say, what does it need to do? Well,
or what do we need to do to rescue it?
So I was asked once, how come you don't say more in the book about what you think the cure is? And I said, well, there's this anecdote about an Austrian medical student in the 19th century, and he's in a hospital in Vienna, and he comes running to his supervisor, doctor, and he says, I'm so sorry, the patient has died. And then the doctor said, well, this is terrible, and he said, I'm so sorry, I'm so apologetic, I can't believe this happened. And the senior doctor says, well, it was the diagnosis we needed. And there's a sense in which
that was Groucho Marx, right?
In some aspects of Western thought, there is a kind of therapeutic nihilism that is more concerned with the accurate description of a problem and a diagnosis rather than a cure. You want a good example of this is psychoanalysis. So my book is, maybe it's a flaw that it's more like that than it is sort of prescribing a cure. But I think that the community formation happens organically, not necessarily quickly, but it happens organically. And that it can be stopped and interrupted and broken and what have you, but sooner or later it will happen if given enough time. And I think that there's a sense in which telling people how to do that is not really going to work and kind of pointless. And in that sense, I'm very, very much on board with classical liberalism. However, there is a kind of liberalism that, in the description that we started with, that was John Stuart Mill's vision of liberalism, which is actually very prescriptive, contrary to what a lot of classical liberals seem to believe, that he has a vision of the good life, which is more about a kind of higher mental contemplation, about sort of intellectual preoccupations and things like that. And he has that famous, somewhat insulting quotation where he says, better Socrates satisfied than a pig satisfied.
No, better Socrates unsatisfied.
Yeah, something like that. Meaning basically, the life of the mind is definitely better than the life of, I don't know, whatever pigs do. Now, I think that there's a sense in which many modern people would respond, well, who are you to say? How do you know? I don't find acting like Socrates to be particularly satisfying or pleasurable. Well, Mill thought so. And, some people might still agree with him or not, but whatever. There is a prescriptive vision there of the good life, but it's doubtful whether it's actually good, or at least it's debatable whether it's actually good and whether it's even pleasurable. And that should be taken on board. I think that liberalism works better, that a doctrine of personal freedom works better in the context of a community, in a context of or what Burke would have called ordered liberty. That may seem hackneyed or banal, but it's true that the sooner or later, probably sooner, extreme visions of personal autonomy and individual freedom will dissolve a community and the freedom will go. The totalitarianisms of the 20th century were based on kind of atomized individuals, communities pulled and torn apart. So ultimately, my answer may be disappointing. It is simply to get out of the way of community formation. That liberals, I think, should take that very much to heart. Now, we are not talking, or at least in my book, I was not talking simply in the abstract. The present moment, I would say, in the West, practically every country in the West, is fraught with problems of loneliness, social decomposition, people who don't see their neighbors, isolation, and a kind of sense of purposelessness or sort of rootlessness. The American Surgeon General in the Biden administration released a huge report called the the epidemic of loneliness and isolation. Now, as an aside, I would say one of the things that I found very surprising about this document, although it, I think, very accurately described a problem, that it seemed to me as though the concept of community formation had been kind of garbled, or it had been sort of forgotten, that it was portraying communities, societies, clubs, what have you, as a kind of accessory to life, as a kind of addition that you can sort of add to your to your activities in life, as opposed to the foundation. Whereas I think in our grandparents' time, the proverbial bowling society, or like the sort of
Robert Putnam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what life was. That was that's what made life solid and so forth. So that is the crisis that we face. And I think it is there's almost like a feedback loop between the problems of liberalism and and our political life, and the crisis of loneliness and isolation. Now, as I say, I believe that the cause of freedom in the West would be better served right now by alleviating that problem, and that liberalism should not frame itself as a protest against institutions or as a solvent against community bonds, because those are not particularly strong right now, or at least not everywhere. And that I think I would like to foresee a new liberalism, much like the mid-20th century liberalism, that is more at ease with those things and is better at helping to put them back together.
So let me just, one final, because I know we're going to go to questions, but bringing it into the present moment, lest anyone believe that we're actually living in a liberal moment or a liberal democratic moment, take a look at the ideologies that are imposed on our society by our government and by our academy. And I'm not making sort of any judgments about the sort of the virtues of those ideologies, but there can't be any doubt that liberalism, if that's what we are living in or experiencing today, and I argue that we are not, we're no longer a liberal democratic society, but that's for another conference, that the state is not operating in a laissez-faire manner when it comes to this question of what is the public good and what does virtue look like. All you need to do is to look at the policies that are now mandatory, that are part of our ecosystem, whether it's DEI, decolonization,
Yes.
or any of the theories. And again, I am not passing judgment on them, either as insightful theories of how the world works or even as how the world ought to be. But I am noticing that the state has taken a very active role, the state and all of the other institutions, including, of course, the academy, in deciding for society as a whole what the public good looks like.
Yeah.
All right? And so we're living in a moment that is very illiberal in that sense. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. The question for me and for I think many in the so-called post-liberal crowd would be: is this something that liberalism opened the door to, or is it a sort of conquest from without?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people would like to think of these ideological elements, or I don't know what you would call it, but basically some of them are kind of akin to signing the Test Act, or putting your name to the 39 Articles of Religion, or depending on your perspective, burning incense before the statue of the emperor. Some would say that these things serve the cause of human freedom. I would vehemently disagree with that.
Yeah.
Some would also say that I think someone like Patrick Deneen would argue that this is precisely what John Stuart Mill had in mind. I think that's a kind of a huge stretch, but you could kind of see where he might be coming from there. So yes, I agree that it is definitely an illiberal moment, but one of the alarming paradoxes, I think, is that it could well be that this is something that we have caused ourselves, simply because we refused to take a position, or because the public good, I think this may be what you were getting at, that the public good was not defined some other way. Now, I grew up hearing over and over and over again about life choices akin to consumer choices, and that this was the sort of the world of globalization and the sort of end of history.
And man is market man.
Right.
Yeah.
And the market, this is something that we could get into at great length, that whereas Immanuel Kant tried to provide a purely rational basis for what I would say are essentially theological positions, that in the late 80s and throughout the 1990s, we had a market as the basis of liberal assumptions and beliefs, and I think that it has proven to be extremely disappointing, and it has basically been unsuccessful. Things like, I dare say, DEI and these other sort of ideological professions that have taken shape, I think that they are serving much the same kind of purpose. Which is again why I would stress the importance of trying to reconnect with older debates and theological assumptions, and that you can kind of see people groping after an essentially kind of religious worldview when it comes to things like equity, or the reasons for evening scores, or sort of instead of treating every single identitarian group the same way, you treat them differently in order to sort of even things out. That is a very liberal idea, but you can see that there are liberal principles buried in there that are being sort of pulled out of shape. And I would, again, perhaps my solution is crazy or naive, but part of it must be reconnecting with the actual origin of the beliefs that we profess.
Yeah, I agree. It's a critically important theme, and I wish we had time to discuss it and explore it, is the ways in which liberalism contains the seeds for its own demise. I mean, I have a theory that I've sort of developed about liberal epistemology that I think actually joins issue with what you're saying now, and it goes to the question of, you know, mankind's relationship with nature, which was radically transformed way back, you know, in the time of Francis Bacon, Novum Organum, and Machiavelli, where suddenly man goes from being one with nature and seeking, you know, insight, you know, into the nature of the good, the just, the various virtues, to suddenly being transformed into a master of nature. The dominion over nature suddenly creates the subjective standpoint and turns us into the authority for everything, including as the source of truth itself. So today, I think you're right, where, you know, DEI and all these things are ways in which we are grasping as a society, indeed as a kind of very large community, to define or to identify the virtues that we all want to live by, but without the guidance of those, you know, of those fundamentals that we get, whether it is from the theology or from the ancient philosophy. So that social justice is really nothing more than an empty vessel. I mean, it could be good, it could be bad. We don't know what it is. All it is a form of distributive justice or redistributive justice.
Yeah.
Taking power from one group, giving it to another, taking wealth from one group, giving it to another. That is all social justice is, but we cannot say that it's virtuous simply because of the label, right? And it's because we're grasping in the darkness for a sense of what is truly good and what is truly important. So I think your book takes us a long way towards sort of coming to reckoning with that problem, with that deficiency. Again, it comes back, or I come back to the question, what do we do about it now? You may want to reflect on this, but I know that we do need to go to questions. So did you want to answer, or can we go to...
I'll build it into an answer. How about
Okay,
that?
so this gentleman's got his hand up right here.
My question is with regards to your last one regarding DEI and anti-colonialism, etc.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, do you think there's a confusion on, I guess, the conception of liberalism as just a political theory in which it's the laissez-faire, the government doesn't interfering into what individuals can do, rather versus the political and, more importantly, the prescriptive conditions that society ought to live in, because you make the connection to community and cohesion, but liberalism, in a very thin conception, has been used to justify extreme market concentration of housing. It's been used to justify inequality, etc. So I guess my question is that by prescribing state interference as inherently illiberal, is not your theory, by that very definition, not attacking the very prescriptive principles of equality, equity, etc., that liberalism ought to create?
Okay, well, my belief here is that whatever, so the term we have not yet used is something like wokeism or wokery or whatever it is that's it's debatable whether that's the right term or not or whatever, but the DEI stuff, decolonization, what have you. I mean, there's a sense in which I was reading about this actually today. This is a kind of Soviet term from like the 60s and 70s. Like, there's a sense in which this doesn't really mean anything anymore, and it's just kind of it's like an old example of like Soviet whataboutism to punish the West and make everybody feel bad, and it was very successful in doing so, and it still seems to work. But the point is that neither of those two things amount to any kind of principle of social formation or of like community formation, solidarity, or whatever. No matter how much they may use those terms, I think some exponents of those belief systems do use terms like that. They're still very much heavy on emphasizing extreme subjectivity and very radical ideas of personal autonomy, which are ultimately very corrosive. Now, it's also not liberal, but I think that they serve almost as a kind of theological foundation or as a philosophical basis, if you like, of a doctrine of freedom, of a doctrine of equality, of a doctrine of autonomy, whatever you like, fill in the blank, of various liberal ideas. But it doesn't work. It's highly unsuccessful, and I could point to one main thing that proves that illustrates the lack of success. It's one thing to say that everybody or some particular group or whatever is evil or is bad or is somehow tainted by something. Liberalism can accept that nobody is perfectly good, right? But you also have to balance that with some notion of dignity and a kind of inherent capacity for goodness. And liberalism has that too, but where does it get it? It gets both those ideas from Christianity. And they are furthermore balanced by notions of, or the sort of, not balanced, but they're sort of underpinned by notions of the creation, the image and likeness of God, and then by original sin. Why is that significant? Because if you have those two ideas, you can say no one is entitled by nature to rule anybody, and nobody is required by nature to obey. Therefore, you can infer all kinds of consequences from that, whereby there are certain aspects of life over which only you can be sovereign. You can change the arrangements of the people who govern you, that your consent is important, and so forth. But if you're just going to insist that one particular group of people is bad and another group is deserving of all these other things, you have the makings of a tyranny. And it will be one of the worst tyrannies, I think, in all of human history, because there's nothing that can, nothing can sort of break out of it. Even the Soviets had kind of a residual, notions of ways to sort of balance this out, which I think that contemporary, whatever you call it, wokery or what have you, doesn't have.
Monty, you have a question, and then we'll go to the back. Then we'll go to those.
Good excuse to stand up. It leads to a segue in terms of when one thinks of theology. Theology is basically power control and how one adumbrates. It's not necessarily to aspire towards what I call a normative good. Man, if you read the King James Version of the Bible, that is literature supreme.
Yes.
It is absolute literature unparalleled with Shakespeare, the dynamics. It's man trying to understand that which he does not know. So no one really knows what is or what is not. And for me, Jesus Christ is the bastard who got nailed. The question I'm going to pose.
Okay, good.
The question I'm going to pose is our scaffolding, power and control. What inspired you to create this particular book? And did you answer the question that you originally were curious about through your many hours of elaboration?
Okay. Okay, my friend Nicholas asked me to write a book. That's one answer.
We don't want to know how the sausage is actually made.
And he said, why don't you tackle this particular, what do you think is going wrong with liberal democracy? And I agreed. But then I also thought that I would have to find something to say. I would basically try to find the weirdest possible thing to say about it. And I personally have always been extremely unconvinced by the theory of a radical break in history with, between what people call the Middle Ages and then whatever you call the period that came after that. If you read any high school textbook on the origins of Western political order, it will always say something like, at the end of the Middle Ages, there were too many conflicts over religion, the authority of the church waned, and then there were all these fights and wars that came about, and then everybody decided to stop doing that, and then they became liberal. That isn't, there's a kind of superficial sense in which that's true, but where did the idea of separating church and state come from? It doesn't come from that, because it's much older. And it's also one of the weirdest things that we still assume to be true, which is not assumed to be true in, for example, the Orthodox Christian world. There is no similar notion.
Or the IRTC.
Right. There's one thing that is both, there's one community that is both state and congregation. And that's what Western Christianity was like until the turn of the first millennium. And then the two were quite violently and aggressively pulled apart. And that is assumed to be normal. It wasn't invented by John Locke or Luther, but even like the craziest reformers like Calvin and Zwingli and company, they insist that there is such a thing as the separation of church and state. And that they didn't say that they invented it or that they think there should be such a thing. They infer a primordial and eternal division, which is crazy if you actually think about it in comparison with other religious ideas and with Western history, because there certainly wasn't such a thing. Did I answer the question I posed to myself? What's wrong with contemporary liberal democracy? Yes and no. I think that it's important to look at it as a matter of belief. It's important to look at, since these are things that you're supposed to believe in, we should ask ourselves why we don't, or why some people don't, and then also importantly why we do. A person that I have for whom I continue to lose respect, Tucker Carlson, was.
You mean you have some respect left?
I once did in the 90s. He was interviewed by the publisher of The Economist, which some of you may have seen. And I forget the context in which it came up. He said, yes, of course I believe in the principles of liberal equality because human beings were made in the image and likeness of God. And then there was sort of an awkward silence for some time, because that just settles the point. And that is exactly what Locke and company asserted as proof for their political doctrine. And there's, seeing that and hearing it, as I happen to do on Twitter, incidentally, it just seems, there's a sense in which that seems really quite obvious. It seems kind of like an obvious thing to say in the context of even the post-Christian West. But then there's also another sense in which that just wouldn't really hold water with many crowds now, and it certainly wouldn't, I imagine, it wouldn't really seem as satisfying as it once did. And until it does, or until there's some other kind of similar Kant-like principle or set of arguments that sort of fill that gap, the question as to why we should believe as liberals do is always going to be sort of left somewhat either unanswered, or it won't be really fully satisfying.
Milton did some time in the Tower of London over his preoccupation with the tyranny of heaven, as he put it. I think this church, we'll go to a question now, but I'm a little troubled by your concerns about the separation of church and state, as though that is really a complete artifice, a complete matter of convention, and doesn't have either a logical or an epistemological grounding. But you don't get to respond to this right now because someone else has his hand up. Yeah, you back there. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael and Peter, for the excellent discourse. Michael, there's an element or theme in your book that I found most compelling, and that I hope you can riff on a bit here. Which is liberalism fundamentally requires a pathic appeal or a normative basis for it to actually remain compelling, and especially for young people today. And we live in a time of crisis. We have enemies inside the castle and outside the castle walls, right? We have post-liberals here and extremists here and down to the south, a lot more of them. And outside the castle walls, right, we have other civilizational states that are posing their own Lebenswelt, their own kind of world system, which is a threat to the Anglo-American liberal civilization. So that element I found very compelling in your book, and maybe you can even touch on it here.
When Francis Fukuyama wrote that, first the question in the article, the end of history, ? And then the book, a lot of people assumed that because they didn't really read it or read out of them that this was sort of the beginning of this sort of rapid spread of liberal democracy everywhere, and that there was really nothing for anybody to do but just sort of sit back and enjoy the sort of unfolding of. I think Pierre Trudeau said the universe is unfolding as it should, or something like that. That was, the universe would unfold as it should in, around 1992 or something. So that didn't happen. And there are many places where it probably never will happen, or maybe at some sort of distant time in the future. And I think there's an interesting question as to why. Now, I think you get a better answer. I mean, I think you get very bad answers when you start talking about things like markets and money and trade and globalization. Why didn't these things open up the world to more liberalism? I just don't think there's any obvious reason to think that should have happened or would have, or I don't know why anybody got those ideas going in the first place. I think you get better answers when you think about belief and culture. It's a particularly Anglo and French, I would add, opinion to hold that everybody in the world is exactly like you, and that the way you think is natural and obvious. And I think Americans are particularly guilty of this, that everybody would agree with you and come to adopt your way of life if only given a chance. That's just not true. Now, we think that way, and I think that we need to, I say we, it's always dangerous to say we, but I think that is a peculiarly Western, European and transatlantic mode of thought that comes from the universalism of Western Christianity. It is not present, I could have written another book about this, in Eastern Christianity, for example, and it's not present in other. It's not present in other forms of culture or religion either. Or when it is present, as for example in Islam, either Shiite or Sunni Islam, it takes a very different form. That there are the visions of what the political community is like and what its needs are different. Now, trying then to graft liberal ideas onto another culture, it may eventually work, but it's not going to work in 10 years. It's not going to work simply in the heyday of the unipolar American triumph of the Soviet Union, and it was weird that anybody thought that it would. Now, again, I'm open to the idea that there can be visions of similar visions or comparable visions of human freedom and equality and so forth that come from that sort of take root in other cultures. But again, I'm something of an expert in Islam. It would still be different. In the case of Islam, there is a vision of human equality that comes not from the creation in the image and likeness of God, but rather in mankind's position as the vicegerent of God, as the ruler on earth in his place. Well, there's certainly a conversation or an exchange of views to be had in that on that subject with the liberal West, but it would still be different. And the idea that we would assume that it would be exactly the same and that it would happen quite suddenly and quickly and so forth is quite naive.
Okay, time for one more question. By the way, I think Pierre Trudeau was in Barbara Streisand's arms when he said that.
Very likely.
Go ahead.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, please join me in giving a big round of applause for these distinguished two speakers. My name is Dost, Renee of Canada, and I'm proud and honored to be with our honorary chair, dear Catherine, my friend and my mentor. 8.2 billion humans on the planet, billion different thoughts, perspectives, as well as perception. Carl Ferguson likes perception much rather than perspective. On the other hand, 190 plus countries on the planet, 190 plus societies, cultures, beliefs and traditions, over 10,000 religions, over 7,000 languages on the planet. I loved all the words that you distinguished speakers delivered. I loved two words mostly: ideas and history, history of ideas. My question is, where do you see the future of liberal democracy in the next 5 to 10 decades? Thank you.
Oh. How shall I put this? However bad things have seemed in the past, they have always got worse, but then they have got better. Now, specifically, someone else pointed out earlier that liberalism has been used to justify all kinds of horrible things. It was, in fact, especially its vision of property rights, it was used, for example, to justify slavery. And we can look back on that and think that that's kind of crazy or evil or what have you. But it was when the theological principle was restored to the claims of liberalism in the form of the abolitionist movement that slavery was done away with. And it was exactly what you would call a religious revival that did it. And I think that comes to us who we feel that we have been thoroughly irradiated by the Enlightenment. I think that may come as a shock or even as an embarrassment, but it keeps happening. It happened again in the American Civil Rights Movement. It happened again in the Polish Trades Union Solidarity's struggle against Soviet communism. It happened again against the South African apartheid. And it can, I think, happen again. And it may, one can argue or hope or assume, it may happen or start to happen in the period, in the pontificate of the first American Pope, who seems to who seems to emphasize I'm not sure what the right word is. He seems to have a particular problem with certain illiberal tendencies within American and European governments, he's taken the name Leo after Pope Leo the XIII, who made social issues and sort of post-industrial atomization and social decomposition a serious matter for his pontificate. And it was he who issued the encyclical Liberty, Libertas, freedom, because of what seemed at the time as certain excesses of European liberalism. I think much the same kind of mode of thought or trend can be detected within the recent encyclical on artificial intelligence. Because if you read, you don't even have to read much between the lines. It's not so much about AI as it is about what human beings are like, what our needs are, what we are for, why we are here. And these are questions that are fundamental both to liberalism and to the community formation that we've been talking about. So there are reasons to be optimistic, I think, within 5 to 10 years. But to quote Kenneth Clark, we might be optimistic, but not joyful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Peter, for leading us through this conversation. And thank you for everybody for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Walker, and I'm the Executive Director for the Canadian International Council. And I see a lot of new faces here today, so that's wonderful, and I would be remiss if I didn't do my membership plug. So please do consider becoming a member if you aren't a member. We do run multiple events, more than 200 across the country. In Toronto, via our Toronto branch, we run more than 40 per year. We have a lot of things going on, and I think some of the ideas raised here today, and as my colleague so succinctly said, history matters, thoughts matter, and discourse matters, and the ability to disagree and to do so civilly increasingly matters. And we have to be able to feel that we can exchange ideas and disagree with each other and challenge each other in a civil way. And that is something that we really try to enshrine in everything that we do within the CIC, because that civil discourse and debate matters more than anything. No matter what your views are on the origins or the solutions for the crisis of liberal democracy, what we need to keep doing is talking, meeting, convening, and having these conversations, and doing so in person. Online is great, but nothing beats an in-person chat, and we really do encourage everybody to stay, talk to each other, ask more questions to Michael. I've heard you absolutely love to debate as well, so if anybody would like to come back and propose a debate, we are also going to be featuring some online debates as well and discussions with Michael as we deep dive into this topic. Again, it's not something that can really be unpacked in 45 minutes, but you did a phenomenal job, and thank you, Peter, for so graciously guiding through these questions. I sort of felt a little bit at times that I was back in my second year political philosophy class, so now I feel like I need to go do some reading, and certainly we'll also read your book. I encourage everyone to please purchase a book if it interests you, and if you do want to learn more on this. We really are going to be also bringing more authors, and I know that Rachel Gilmore is here, and she's our September author as well, and so we're so pleased. We'll invite everyone back for her book, which is focusing on engaging youth in politics, called Renegade Politics. And our sincere thanks to Dundurk Press. This is, again, a very important civic engagement and education series for the CIC, so please do check us out online. Come talk to me, come talk to my peer Jennifer, if you want to learn anything more. And gentlemen, thank you so much for tonight.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes, you can.
Can I just interject at the end, because I've got my friend Doug Anweiler here, and I know that he's going to kill me if I don't say this. Section 1 is also presenting this event, and
Thank you to Section 1.
And there's some really important Section 1 people here, including our first executive director, who's going to be starting very soon, but she won't want me to name her until I can't name you, can I? I can't. So she's not here. But we are doing really wonderful work in the service of the cause of liberal democracy, combating democratic backsliding, and developing a curriculum for liberal democratic citizenship, what we call arming the civic immune system. So check us out as well. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have you involved, and we certainly would love your support. And it was really a privilege to work with you and with the CIC on this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Yes, thank you very much for also bringing us together in this context and in this beautiful environment, and for guiding the debate. We're very pleased to have Section 1 helping to facilitate the conversation. And there's more wine, I'm hearing. So there's more wine and food. So Jennifer will open the door here, and everyone's encouraged to please go to the patio, and please do continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.